Yeah, my name is Larry Furchild with Cooperative Strategies, members of the board, superintendent, cabinet. Have a brief presentation to go over, kind of an overview of the process that the district is going through in its conversion from an at-large method of election to a by-area method of election. Walk through the timeline for a little bit, talk about the district's demographics, and then really get into the purpose of tonight's public hearing, provide some background for speakers who may want to present some input on what the areas should look like before we start drawing those different voting areas. So a little bit of background. Again, in California, there are 3 different ways that school boards can be elected. There's the current at-large method of election that the district uses. There's a from-area method of election. That is where there could be 5 different voting areas within, or 5 different areas within the district, but members are still elected at large. One person has to reside within each area, but it's still an at-large election. And then the third being the by-area method of election, which is what you're converting to. The by-area method of election is the only one that is in the safe harbor from challenge under the California Voting Rights Act. And as you know, you've received a demand letter related to the California Voting Rights Act and compliance. And a little bit of history. I know you probably heard about this at the last meeting, but what is the California Voting Rights Act? It took effect in 2003, and it prohibits the use of at-large elections, which would be either the at-large method that you're currently using or that from-area method. It prohibits the use of those elections when such systems can be shown to impair the ability of members of protected classes, and protected classes are defined under the Federal Voting Rights Act as historic language, color, or race within the country. It inhibits the ability for members of protected classes to elect candidates of their choice or influence the outcome of an election. And so in response to the demand letter, the district has taken action to adopt a resolution initiating the transition or conversion from the current at-large to the by-area method of election. And that starts the clock on a lot of action items that the district has been moving very rapidly on. We have a very short timeline in order to make sure this process can be completed in time for the November 2020 election. And so from last week's board meeting to now, staff has been very busy in getting the word out about tonight's meeting and future meetings on this process to make sure the community is informed of this and is able to provide input as you move forward so that you can make a decision on a map with as much feedback as possible. So you see we have tonight's first pre-map public hearing. We're required to hold 2 hearings before any maps are drawn. So the first one is tonight, and the next one is a week from tonight, same time as tonight's. So we'll have those 2 pre-map public hearings. And then February 13th, we're scheduled to hold our first public hearing on the maps themselves. Prior to that 13th meeting, we are required to have the maps available for public review for 7 days on the district's website. So on or about February 6th, those maps will be posted for the public and board to see and begin to start thinking about them, developing the feedback that you may have to share with us at the board meeting on February 13th. I'll use this moment right now just to plug that the district has set up a robust website already that's only going to continue to have more information as this process moves forward. There's an email address on that website for anybody who has specific comments that they may want to submit in writing in between public hearings or instead of speaking those points at public hearings. There's additional dates that aren't on this calendar yet here that will be for community input meetings as well. So we have a public hearing on February 13th on the map scenarios. We also have a public hearing on the 13th on the general waiver request. And as you know, that the conversion of election methods would typically trigger an election just on the question of whether you can change your election method. So typically under the law, if a school district says they want to change from at-large to by-area, they would then have to go to the voters and seek approval of that process. Because of the expedited timeline that we're on, because of the risk of potential litigation if it wasn't approved, almost every district, I would say 99% of districts that have converted their election methods since 2010 have sought for and received a waiver from the State Board of Education to make that change without having to go to the voters. It is routine at the State Board. They hear half a dozen to a dozen of them every other month when they meet. So every district that I've worked with through this process, and that's over 50 of them, have sought for and received a waiver from the election requirement. So that public hearing and consideration of the waiver request would also be at the February 13th meeting. February 27th would be the second public hearing on the map scenarios, the ability for the board potentially to narrow down the scenarios that would be under consideration at the final public hearing and selection process on the March 12th board meeting, at which point the board would be asked to select a map and approve the final resolution, which is also essentially a petition to the County Committee on School District Organization to approve the change in election method and the map that you've selected. You see from there, we're looking at April, May as the time frame for the County Committee on School District Organization to hold a public hearing here in the district and consider approving the district's request to change its election method. We're thinking May would be when the state board would hear the district's waiver application, so by May to have this process wrapped up in time for the November 2020 election. Obviously, we have to give some time for the registrar to make sure they understand what the precincts will look like as a result of this creation of voting areas, and that candidate filing period can occur in, whether it's June or July, with all this information available. So that's the timeline. Again, there's more dates of additional community input meetings that will be on the district's website. So I just encourage members of the public to continue checking that website. There'll be additional notifications that will go out as well as we seek input throughout this process. So as we go through this process of drawing trustee areas, one of the questions often asked is, well, how do you do it? What are the thoughts that go into this process? So we have some of the standard considerations or criteria that go into it. And first and foremost, the areas have to be roughly equal in terms of total population. And we're allowed a variance of up to 10% between the largest and smallest areas. We'll talk a little bit more about the numbers on the next slide, but that's our primary driver, is having roughly equal areas on total inhabitants, regardless of whether people are old enough to vote or have citizenship status or anything like that. And that population number is based on the 2010 census, because that's the most recent count of actual people in the district. We recognize that in April, so right when we're wrapping up this process, the Census Bureau is going to be asking for new information from us, but that information won't be available until April of 2021. Once we get that data in 2021, the district will have to look at those numbers and see if the areas that are created are still within balance or not. If they are, then the areas can continue to exist the way they were created. If they're not, you would have to make some adjustments to bring them back under that 10% threshold. The next thing that we need to look at is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. So we can't do anything in this process, as the California Voting Rights Act requires. We can't do anything in this process that inhibits members of protected classes from being able to influence the outcome of elections. We often give the example, we can't take an area of a large protected class community and we can't divide it into three and dilute their voting strength. That would be a violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act if we diluted the ability of members of protected classes from being able to influence the outcome of elections. And you'll see on some slides here in a minute what that will look like. The areas have to be compact, and they have to, as possible, and they have to be contiguous, meaning we can't start a trustee area on one side of the district, stop, and pick up on the other side. So no Swiss cheese looking trustee areas. We're supposed to respect communities of interest as much as possible. And I think a lot of the feedback that we'll be seeking from the public and from the board is, what are those communities of interest? Help us understand what communities make sense to be together, what areas make sense to not be together. We want to look at following man-made and natural geographic features, so major roads, freeways, railroad tracks, anything like that that makes sense. Incumbency is an allowable consideration, but it can't be a primary consideration. And then other local considerations the board or the public may suggest. School attendance boundaries, number of schools within each area, those are types of considerations to make as well that the board could direct us to look at. One thing I'll point out here is as you're transitioning or converting your election method, the district is still governed by a 5-member board. It's not as if an individual board member is the board member for that particular school area and has final say on all things in that school. It still takes a full board working together, and that doesn't change through this process. It just affects how you're elected to the board, but really you still have a fiduciary responsibility to all schools across the district. And so even though you're converting from an at-large to a by area, it is still a responsibility for all schools across the district, and something that a lot of districts work on through policy and board norms through this process as you're making that conversion. So we talked a little bit about census data. So we see total population of the district 116,506 residents as of the 2010 census. And so we'll divide that in 5. And I should have brought my calculator up with me, but was that about 20,000 people? 23,000 people each across 5 areas. And you can see the largest group there being the Latino population at 65%, followed by the Asian population at 22.34%, and the white population at 10%. All the other populations about 1% or less. And so the map on the left-hand side just showing the various communities within the district, cities or census-designated places that we'll be looking at those boundaries. But this is just to give a flavor of what the total population looks like. Again, that's anybody who is in the district as of April 2010, regardless of their citizenship status or age. Age 18 and over would be if everybody who was 18 and over and registered to vote did. That would be the population numbers there. So you can see very similar breakout of the population groups. And then for Federal Voting Rights Act requirements, we're also going to look at citizen voting age population, which we abbreviate as CVAP.
All right, sorry, one of the board members wants to ask a question.
Sorry.
Actually, I want to ask a bunch of questions, but on the last one there,
Sure.
right? You showed,
There we go.
yeah, that one. You
Yeah.
showed.
Turn your microphone on, please.
It actually is, so
It
thanks.
is?
So, right there, you have total population that you have over the age of 18, right? And then before that, you had that you look at the number of inhabitants and you looked at communities of interest, right?
Mhm.
But the CVRA actually deals with, you're talking about a protected class, right? And in reality, the term that they use is racially polarized voting, right? So my question is, we talk about communities of interest, but we're talking protected class. Protected classes are like right here, right? So I was kind of wondering.
I can't hear you.
I was kind of wondering why.
Speak into the
you
mic,
had-
please.
I am speaking into the mic.
Very good, now you are.
So, we got communities of interest, but it says protected class, which is actually a constitutional term, right? And racially polarized voting. And then I look at this, you have total population and age 18 and over. Which one do they look at? They look at the total population, or they look at the voting age, right, which is 18 and over?
So we're going to look at a bunch of different things at the same time. So when we're talking about the California Voting Rights Act, it speaks to you can't have at-large elections to the extent you can show that racially polarized voting has occurred and caused the members of protected classes from not being able to influence the outcome of elections. So once you've made that decision to convert from an at-large to by area, you've left the California Voting Rights Act, you're in compliance with the California Voting Rights Act, and now you fall really under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the drawing of trustee areas and then the process involved there is really under the Federal Voting Rights Act. The Federal Voting Rights Act has been interpreted through case law as being something where you need to consider race and ethnicity, but it can't be the sole consideration. It's one of those, you look at it, but you can't make it your sole decision-making factor. So when we talk about communities of interest and creating areas of increased influence for members of protected classes, we can't make race the sole consideration. So I think if we look at this map, if we were to draw it, so just those areas that had high Latino concentration, which is what this map is illustrating, were in one area. We just went through and surgically kind of sliced it up. Then we would be violating the Federal Voting Rights Act, even though we at the same time we were increasing Latino voting power because we were using race as the sole consideration. So when we talk about communities of interest and increasing, and understanding those, we want to make sure that we're drawing them based on communities of interest and also considering the race and ethnicity of the voters who reside there. So for Federal Voting Rights Act purposes, we are going to look at the citizen voting age population to inform the maps that we create. So total population to make sure we have the roughly equal areas, and then the citizen voting age population to make sure we're in compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act.
Right, so when you were looking at the other chart, the total population over 18 was more relevant, right?
More relevant, but this even more relevant. Because
Well,
this
I
is
get that.
registering.
I get that, I'm not
Yeah.
asking that question, I was looking at the other question, right? But ethnicity is a significant component, right? I mean, that's how you get the term racially polarized voting,
Mhm.
right? And a protected class, which is generally going to be defined under those parameters.
Sure.
So are you saying that even under, when you draw this, it has to be under the Federal Voting Rights Act as opposed to the California Voting Rights Act?
Again, the California Voting Rights Act speaks only to at-large elections and the ability of those to prevent members of protected classes from being able to influence the outcome of election. The remedy under the California Voting Rights Act is a conversion to a by-area method of election. And there's really nothing in the California Voting Rights Act other than language about how they're implemented in terms of meeting schedules and amount of time that you have to have in between meetings that speaks to how the areas are to be drawn. There's considerations under the California Constitution, under the Elections Code, and under the Federal Voting Rights Act that speak to how we have to draw these areas in a way that, number one, to meet total population balance, and then ensure that members of protected classes aren't being harmed through this process.
So could you conceivably, and I just want to be clear about
Sure.
this, go from an at-large to a by-district, right? Because that's what the remedy is under the CVRA.
Mm-hmm.
And then you draw it under the Federal Civil Rights Act. And then after you draw it, and the resulting outcome still violates the CVRA.
You can't violate the CVRA in a by-area election.
Yeah.
Because the CVRA only speaks to at-large elections and their impairment of members of protected classes. Once you go to a by-area method of election, you're out of the CVRA, and really the Federal Voting Rights Act is what is going to ensure that you're not doing anything that's going to harm the ability of protected classes from influencing the outcome of elections.
So once you go into, because according to what you're saying, the remedy is to have by district and CVRA.
Correct.
So then by definition, after that's done, that you could not have a finding of a racially polarized voting or the dilution of votes for a protected class.
Under the California Voting Rights Act. Any others?
Those are my questions right now.
Okay.
Please continue.
All right, so back to this slide. This is the Latino citizen voting age population estimate map. So you see on the right-hand side of the screen, the darker the color in red, the higher the concentration of Latinos who are citizens and of voting age. And we'll do the same thing on the Asian population in the next slide. So this is an estimate that is a little bit more current than the census data that we're using for total population balance. This is a 2013 through 17 estimate. Just to give you the inside baseball stuff on this, every year the Census Bureau does a sampling of the population and aggregates those into 5-year rolling averages through what's known as the American Community Survey, or ACS. They release this data, and then we call it, and it's called the CVAP data, so citizen voting age population. Again, people who are 18 and over, citizens of the United States. It is an estimate, and this helps inform the areas that we're going to create to see, are we able to create areas of increased influence for members of protected classes. So we see here in Hacienda Puente, the northern side of the district having areas of higher concentration of Latino citizen voting age population. And then if we were to turn the slide here, this is the Asian citizen voting age population map, and we can see increased areas of Asian citizen voting age population generally in the southern parts of the district. And so on citizen voting age populations, about 60% Hispanic Latino, about 26% Asian, and about 11 and 2/3% white. Those are just the breakouts there, how that citizen voting age population works out. So when we see these maps prepared, we'll see data on total population, we'll see data on population 18 and over, and we'll see population data on citizen voting age population, so we can see what these maps look like on all three metrics. So with that background, this is really the point of tonight's public hearings for the community is to provide input on how these lines should be drawn. We're starting with a blank slate. We haven't started drawing maps because the law says we can't. We are starting with an empty map and looking to hear feedback on what makes sense to the board and community on how these lines should be drawn, knowing that we're outsiders to this community. We're coming at it with a fresh perspective, but also want to be informed by everybody who's lived here. So what kind of examples are helpful? Because a lot of times we'll come to these meetings and folks won't know what to say. How do you start with a blank slate and say what you'd like it to look like? But sometimes it's helpful just to hear, I think this neighborhood, give me a description of that neighborhood, and that neighborhood should be in the same trustee area. I think that certain dividing lines make sense. Highway 60, should that be a dividing line or not? Hacienda Boulevard, I just gave some examples. Valley Boulevard. What we'll also find is those may not make sense. There may be a major road in town where both sides of that road are really the same community. And to an outsider, it may not look that way. It may make sense to go down Valley or Hacienda, but in reality, both sides of Hacienda are the same community, and that type of feedback is helpful to hear. So I've heard that in different districts to kind of help us know what are good dividing lines and what aren't good dividing lines through this process. Other feedback, all of X community or Y community should be in one area. Each middle school, elementary school should be in multiple areas or single areas. And as we talk about the conversion from at-large to by area, a lot of districts have made it a priority to have trustee areas that cross multiple attendance boundaries, so that there's multiple trustees that each school community is connected to, and each trustee is connected to multiple school communities through this voting process. So that's something that's helpful for feedback as well, with some of the reasoning behind that. So with that, certainly open it up for any questions, and then for members of the public to provide that input as we move forward.
Thank you. You mentioned in the beginning one of the reasons why we're moving forward with trustee districts, but can you talk a little bit more about the letter and why the district is moving forward with this?
Sure. The district received, so under the law, a resident can submit through an attorney a demand letter that gives the public agency 30 days within which to make a decision as to whether or not to continue with at-large method of election or convert to a by-area method of election. So the district received such a demand letter, and rather than saying no, which would then trigger the ability for that party to file a lawsuit against the district has decided to move forward with the conversion in line with the potential plaintiff's demand, if you will, because it's a demand letter, to have that done by the November 2020 election. There have been agencies that have declined to move forward with those demand letters, and then a lawsuit can be filed. Those lawsuits have never been successfully won by a public agency in the state of California. The standard that's been laid out in the courts has been vague as to what a violation of the California Voting Rights Act looks like. If you are unsuccessful in defending yourself against a California Voting Rights Act challenge, you are responsible for obviously paying for your own attorneys through this process, but also paying the prevailing parties attorney's fees and any expert witness fees. Some of those have been in the 7-figure dollar amounts that have been entered into as judgments against public agencies. The great thing is even if you were to win, which nobody has yet, if you were to win, you still have to have paid your own attorney's fees. You can't seek attorney's fees from the party that filed the lawsuit against you. So, for most public agencies, the decision comes down to moving forward to save the resources that could go to a legal challenge to be used in the classroom or whatever public function that agency is using, rather than to go for attorney's fees.
Thank you. We'll open up to the board for any questions. Mr. Plott?
Looking at me,
Next,
right?
lean forward.
The letter triggers a time period, right? And the first time period, because there's a safe harbor, is a 45-day time period to review a resolution of intent to go by district voting, right?
Correct.
Right. So, and then there's that other timeline that happens afterward about the vote meetings and all those other things, right? But the letter doesn't mandate that they go to by district voting in 2020, depending on the process. However, with that said, this board wants to go ahead and do that. At least the majority does that, right? So I think that's a very good faith effort to go ahead and do that. And I just want to make sure that the timeline that you put up there, because I actually don't think it's comprehensive, but I think that it's pretty good. It has more than not. That we meet that timeline. That because there's a lot of things that are going on right?
Sure.
So you gotta go to the LA County Committee on School District Organization. You mentioned that SBE, that's correct, right? I do have one question about that, which is how is that done? Do you know the process of the SBE and how you get the waiver?
Sure. So after there's a process the district has begun to meet and confer with its bargaining units. So it has sent notification to its bargaining units as well as its advisory councils. I believe every school site council has received through the site principal a letter asking for feedback on this waiver process. And the district advisory committee and the English learner advisory committee or English language advisory committee has also received this letter. So before the district can act on requesting the waiver, you have to seek feedback from your advisory committees and your bargaining units. And so that process is underway, I believe as of today, with those notifications. And we've asked for feedback to come back by early February as to whether those groups are support, oppose, or neutral on that request. The district will then hold a public hearing on the February 13th agenda to seek any additional feedback that may not have been received. Assuming the board approves the district moving forward with the waiver request, there's an online form that the district will fill out outlining what it seeks to waive in terms of the education code, who it's consulted with and what their positions are. And really that's about it in terms of what needs to be on the form. That gets submitted. There's a 2-month window, 2-month window between when you submit something and when it can get on an SBE agenda. And so that's why we want to have this done in February so that we're sure to get it in time for the May meeting. Gives SBE about a month before the 2-month window to get that done. And so that will be reviewed by staff at the California Department of Education to make sure we've dotted all our I's and crossed all our T's. And then they will submit it for consideration at the May SBE meeting. And actually that usually goes on the consent calendar. There will be a grouping of districts on the consent calendar for the waiver application. I think at the January meeting I looked and I saw 6 to 10 of them, all just grouped together as one item for the state board to approve.
Right, actually I saw 8.
Okay.
All right,
That's close.
again, right in the middle, right? And so this is the one part about it, because I'm strongly in favor of doing this and making sure, I just want to make sure the timeline is, when I looked at this, it was actually a submission by the CDE, the California Department of Education. And in there, they talked about these things. And they talked about fiscal impact, they talked about the districts, the ADA, and so forth, right? And so when I looked at that, I thought that was very interesting because it was clearly from the CDE. And in there, as I kind of looked at this thing, is I think you're right in terms of the nature of it. Because who wants to go through an election, right? Because that's what the Ed Code states. It says that it has to be approved by the committee, the county committee on school district organization, and by the voters in a district-wide election, so it's the election department. And we certainly don't want to have to go through that. And when I looked at this, what was interesting was that it came from the CDE. And then as part of this, I was able to see, as I was looking at this, is that, you're right, there's been about 194 districts that have been approved by the SB, the State Board of Education, in order to go ahead and do that. So, again, I just want to make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's, right, because of the timeline, to make sure that we meet that timeline.
Yeah, one of the to-dos on our list is just to alert, and it's on my list to do, is to alert staff at CDE that the district's request will be forthcoming so that they're aware of it. And it is, school districts are the only public agencies that have to go through this extra step, actually the 2 extra steps, both the county committee process that is specific to school districts and having to seek a waiver from the election requirement. If you were a city, you wouldn't have to do either of those things.
And it would seem to me that we can do this contemporaneously, right? It's not just one right after the other, right? So for example, we can go to county and then go to SBE.
Yes, at one point in time, they required, or SBE wanted you to finish the process
Right.
before you submit the waiver application, but recognizing the timeline has to be compressed, especially the one we're operating under. They understand really the waiver doesn't have anything to do with the map you select. The waiver has to do with the election requirement, and so they will take these as early as possible, and that's why we've agendized it for very early in the process. We just want to make sure we have enough meet and confer time before we
I'm
take
very
it.
happy to hear that, because that was the way I kind of looked at it, because I didn't want it to be like that, otherwise you're having problems. And there's
cannot hear
another
you.
on this, is that I saw that there was actually a March meeting too, by the SBE, so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, we realized we couldn't meet the March meeting where we are in the calendar.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone else have any questions? All right, seeing none. So what we're gonna do is, again, those of you who have submitted cards, we're gonna.
Thank you, President Forte, members of the board. Larry Furchow with Cooperative Strategies. Similar to last week's presentation, we've added a couple slides and some information points for folks who were here last week, so they're not too bored, and folks who weren't here last week, it'll be all new information. So I'll go through this real as quickly as I can here. So as you know, the district is changing, they're converting its election method. There are three types of election methods that school districts have access to use. One is the at-large method of election that you currently utilize. One is a from-area method of election, which is essentially an at-large method, but with different geographic areas that board members have to be elected from. And then there's the type of election method you're transitioning or converting to, which is the by-area method of election, where you have what will be 5 voting areas in the district, with a board member elected from each of those areas only by the residents, voters within each of those 5 areas. And as we note here, this is the only method of election that is immune from challenge under the California Voting Rights Act. Which brings the question, what is the California Voting Rights Act? It took effect in January 2003, and it prohibits the use of at-large elections in instances where they can impair the ability of members of protected classes, which are historic, race, color, or language minority groups within this country from being able to influence the outcome of elections. Protected classes defined under the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. In response to a demand letter that was received by the district, the board has adopted a resolution initiating the conversion from the at-large method of election to a by-area method of election in time for the November 2020 election. And we talked about last week that this is something that, due to the potential cost of defending a California Voting Rights Act lawsuit, and the uncertainty of winning or losing, that the district has decided to make this conversion at the suggestion of the demand letter. It certainly isn't indicating one way or the other whether there was any validity to the allegations or the substance of the allegations, but just moving forward to get this done in time for the 2020 election. So recognizing this is a pretty large change in how the district functions in terms of governance, we wanted to detail the public outreach methods. We didn't do this last time around, and we wanted to really highlight all the things that the district is doing that are well above and beyond what is required. So starting on January 23rd, all families within the district received a letter indicating this is the district's conversion process, the schedule of meetings, and inviting folks to come to these meetings, as well as to check out the district's website page that's specifically devoted to this topic. An email was sent to all staff that same day. School messenger calls have gone out to the entire school community on multiple occasions. Marquees district-wide, every school site has indicated when these public hearings will be. Postcards. So you'll see on the right a sample of what that postcard is going to look like. These are going to be printed, and they're in the process of being printed, and will be mailed to every address within Hacienda La Puente Unified School District, regardless of whether or not the families attend schools here. So every resident within the district will be aware that these meetings will occur, starting with next week's public hearing that we'll talk about. So again, everybody in the district, regardless of whether they have students attending your schools. Media releases, press release was sent in advance of last week's meeting. Additional advisories have been sent throughout the process, and they will be sent as we continue with the public meeting and map release process. Advertising, there was legal ad and display ads in the Southern California news groups, and there will also be a quarter-page ad that will be placed in advance of the community meetings that we'll talk about as well. So the district has engaged its public relations firm to make sure that the word gets out on this. We talked about the website, so hlpschools.org/CVRA. Has information on the conversion process, the email address with where to send comments to, a phone number where you can leave a message about comments, questions, anything like that. So all the public notices, the demand letter the district received, as well as the map that was included in it, frequently asked questions, all these riveting presentations, notices that were provided in English, Spanish, and traditional Chinese. All of this, of course, is accessible via smartphones. Maps will be posted to this website by Thursday, February 6th. I'll also point out that each school within the district has been provided with a laptop computer for the front office for just access to this website for folks in the community who may not have internet access. So that is also happening. And in addition to the maps being posted on Thursday, they will also be distributed to all of the school sites as well. So they will be available in paper format as well, starting on either Wednesday or Thursday. And so in addition to all those traditional means, in addition to the website, it's been in your Instagram, your Facebook, your Twitter, however you get your social media information. So you can see there was links posted on Facebook. The community letter was also pushed out on Facebook on the district's page, as well as to people who are within the district. So you can see all that information there, and we'll continue to push out information through these social media methods as well to let folks know where we are in the process and where they have an opportunity to provide feedback as we go through information. So then back to some familiar information here. Total population of the district as of the 2010 census, 116,506 people, which is 5 roughly equal areas of 23,300 people. You can see the breakdown of ethnicity on total population: 65% Hispanic or Latino, 22.3% Asian, and 10.01% white. You can see the information on population 18 and over. I will pause to say that since we're talking about 2010 census data, we know there's a census that's starting in less than 2 months now. That after that new census data is released in about April of 2021, the district, if it continues and makes this conversion, will have to look at that new census data after it is released and determine if the map is still in compliance with that 10% variance, or if there need to be changes made in order to bring it in compliance with that new population data. Other data that we look at, and this is really for Federal Voting Rights Act purposes, so we look at total population to have our 5 roughly equal areas, and then we look at citizen voting age population, which is an estimate of folks who are 18 and over and citizens of the United States. So this is kind of the universe of everybody. If they chose to register to vote, this would be who could register to vote, and it's an estimate. But this looks at our population breakdown at just under 60% Latino, about 26% Asian, and 11 2/3% white. The map on the right side of this slide highlights the areas of increased citizen voting age population for the Latino population. The red, dark red areas are higher concentrations of Latino citizen voting age population. So the darker the red, or that orange color, indicates a higher concentration of that population. Did the same thing on this when we flip the map there. This is for the Asian citizen voting age population, the other large protected class within the school district's boundaries, and you can see there's a higher concentration more in the south and eastern part of the district where those darker blue colors are. So, the focus of tonight's public hearing, or the purpose as stated in the law, is to seek and receive feedback on how the lines should be drawn. Which is a tough question to answer because we're kind of starting with a blank slate. It's a little easier if we've got some map options to look at, but folks in Sacramento, with all their wisdom, thought it would make more sense for us to start with a blank slate and ask for people to provide feedback on it this way. So, what are we looking for? Examples of that feedback include, what neighborhoods do people think should be together? I think this neighborhood and that neighborhood should be in the same area, or I don't think that neighborhood and that neighborhood should be in the same area. I think certain roads should be used as dividing lines. Highway 60, Hacienda Boulevard, Valley Boulevard. Name a road you think should be a good dividing line, or vice versa should not be a good dividing line. Maybe both sides of Hacienda Boulevard really are one community, and should be kept together as opposed to using it as a dividing line. So that's the type of feedback that is helpful to hear as we embark on this map drawing process. I think certain communities should be in one area. I think each boundary should be in multiple areas, meaning school attendance boundaries, or each boundary should be in single areas. Each trustee should have, equal number of school sites, or that doesn't matter. Those kinds of things, and help us as we embark on this process. And that's all I have, is kind of setting the table for the public hearing, unless there's any questions from the board before opening it up for public comments.
Does anyone from the board have any questions? Mr. Clark?
See you again.
Nice to see you as well.
Just a few things. So earlier you had indicated that we have a laptop at every school site, right?
Yes.
And so I just want to make sure that that's going to be promoted to the community so that they know that that's out there.
We will work on making sure that is known if it isn't already been done.
I believe that Dr. Ton is somewhere, and together with Ms. Strandat and Mr. Hansberger this morning have discussed about that. All of that information will be shared. And then we also are talking about also could be another school messenger to send out to all of this committee, and to promote all of that as well. And also another thing that I just want to share, that we also talk about the date and the location. The date was determined already, but the location, we don't have it yet, because according to the way we understand it, that depending on the map, then we would select the location. So that's the reason why that we haven't have a location yet. Not, we don't want to give to post the location, just want to make sure we are very clear about that.
Can we have high school quads be part of it, since they're kind of like spread throughout the district?
Yes, that will be on the consideration as well, as soon as, and that's probably will be the largest area, that's so we can have the meeting over there.
Thank you.
Well, my point was that it was specifically stated here in the presentation that each school site would have a laptop for this purpose. So that would include high school, that would include every school site. So all my point was, it is beneficial from a public standpoint to go ahead and have a laptop. I think that's a good thing. All I'm saying is, let's make sure they know that that's there. That's basically it, right? I'm glad you added the other part, because I had spoken about the CBR before, about the racially polarized voting, about losing the voting power of a protected class. So I'm glad to see that. I mentioned before about how you put that up there in terms of total population, and then the population 18 and over, right? So what's more applicable is 18 and over, right?
The numerator in our formula is total population. That's 116,000 people that we're dividing into 5 roughly equal areas.
Okay, but when we talk about voting, we talk about individuals that can actually vote, right?
Correct. But
Right.
the case law has held that it's based on total residents. Just like your congressional seats are apportioned to the states and outwards based on total population of the states, not based on the number of people who are old enough to or able to vote.
So then you can have a situation where it would align to the population, but not necessarily align to the voting population, and that's permissible.
Yes.
And the other part of it is, I just want to highlight, is that the only way that we can go ahead and do that for 2020 would be through the waiver process, correct?
Yes.
I did see that it was interesting that even if you went through the other process, that you still had potential liability. So at any rate, the only way in terms of timing, again, is going through the waiver.
Yeah, if you didn't do the waiver, then the election would be on the ballot for the November 2020 election, which would push the first by-area election until 2022. At which
Right,
point you would have had to draw it.
but it doesn't address the issue, because you still have significant liability with respect to that.
So you'd be holding 2 at-large elections within the
Right.
course of that 2020 ballot.
So that, again, the only way is going through the waiver, which nearly 200 school districts have already done.
Yes, I'm aware of very few that did not pursue a waiver.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could you put the slide back to the map? That one, yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
This one, right?
I don't have any questions, but I want to leave this up while we're going through the public hearing, because I want to stress that what we're here for tonight is to get input from the community on what you want these districts to look like. And you're taking notes, I saw you taking notes yesterday for all the input of the community. So we really want to stress that. Take a look at the maps, think about your communities where you live, the quads you live in, the schools your kids go to, and really provide that input. So we're gonna leave that up here, so while you're speaking, you can look at the map and maybe say some remarks about it, because that's what we really want to get tonight. Because this is the last evening that we are taking input for the maps, and as the gentleman said, we are gonna be rolling out the maps on Thursday night. So we really want to hear from the community on what you want your districts to look like. Thank you for the presentation, and we'll go ahead and get started.
And so, Mr. President, we can go 5 minutes like we did last time, correct?
Yeah, normally for our communications, we do 3 minutes, but because it's a hearing and we want to hear from you, we're increasing it to 5 minutes. So you have 5 minutes to speak.
My name is Corey Burback, and I'm here representing Cooperative Strategies, the district's demographer, as they consider the conversion from the at-large to, thank you very much, to the by-trustee area election method. So tonight, it's our first opportunity as a board and community to discuss the 4 proposed trustee area maps for the first time, again, at a board meeting. Before we get to the exciting part, we'll kind of recap the schedule for this proposed conversion. We'll talk about some of the key considerations that were made when drafting the maps, and then we will cover the 4 scenarios before the important part of opening it up to the community. So again, as mentioned by the board, tonight is the first post-map public hearing. The district had 2 pre-map public hearings, one on January 27th and one on February 3rd. The next post-map public hearing will be on February 27th, with the final board meeting occurring on March 12th, before we go to the County Committee on Schools, have the waiver process in May, and then we will work with the County Register of Voters in May as well, all leading up to the first election, with possibly having trustee areas in November of 2020. As again mentioned earlier, before I got up here, not only do we have the board meetings as an opportunity for the community to weigh in, the district has already met with DLAC on February 4th. They also had a CVR meeting for student groups on the 7th, last Friday, and we have 5 additional community input meetings that will take place between now and February 22nd. And if you look at the maps, I know that each community meeting is in a represented trustee area for all of the proposals.
Sorry, can you go back to that?
I don't know. There you go.
And this information is on our website, correct?
Yeah, it should be on the
It is
district
on our
website. So, you want me to go ahead? So I often say that when drawing maps, it's part art and part science. My wife jokes because this is about as artistic as I get. But some of the key considerations that really shape these maps are listed here below. And I'll just quickly cover those with the board and community. First, we want to make sure, and we must ensure, that each area shall contain equal number of inhabitants. We can't have the largest trustee area by law be 10% larger than the smallest trustee area. Not only do we have to comply with the California Voting Rights Act, but we need to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act as well. We want areas to be as compact, contiguous, cohesive, and provide as much integrity as possible. I can't have a trustee area cover a small portion of the west side of the district and another portion of the east side of the district. I can't have a trustee area look like a donut, those types of things. We want to respect communities of interest. Again, this is part of the art when we're hearing the feedback and part of the process that we get from the community. We want to follow man-made features. We want constituents and our community to look up the trustee area maps and be able to easily delineate which trustee area they're in. And then we can respect incumbency if provided that direction by the board. I always stipulate that it can never be the sole consideration though. And then again, we want to consider as much local input as possible. We recognize that we don't live here, y'all do, and so how do we kind of take as much of that from you as we can. For the part science portion of the maps, the first data set that we rely on is the most recent census, and that's how we ensure that we don't violate that 10% variance requirement. For us, the 2010 census is the most recent, and so if you look at our total population at that time, we want to look at trying to create 5 trustee areas with roughly 23,000 constituents. The next data set that we utilize is what's called the citizen voting age population estimates. When we look at the citizen voting age population, we're trying to get a greater understanding of the makeup of our community and where people reside. Again, it cannot be a sole consideration, but if we can create a trustee area that has a majority influence from our Hispanic, Latino, or our Asian population, we are required to do so. The map that's represented on the right is kind of what we refer to as a heat map. It shows where we have higher concentrations of certain types of voters. And so again, the CVAP is a 5-year average looking back. I often say that, especially in more rural districts, that it may look very dark, but you could only have a couple voters, so it's a little misleading, but again, is a pretty good representation of your community. So the map on the right is for our Hispanic population. The next map, we've done the same thing for our Asian population. Now to the fun part. I will kind of walk the board and the community through the 4 scenarios with a kind of general description of how we kind of define each trustee area referencing cities as well as boundaries. So on this scenario number 1, and I always like to stipulate, I'll take a step back here. Trustee area number 1 is always going to be yellow. Trustee area number 2 is always going to be green. Trustee area number 3 is red. Trustee area number 4 is going to be blue. And trustee area number 5 is purple. That's not going to change regarding this scenario. So in scenario 1, we kind of look at trustee area 1 as the northeast portion of the district. It covers the city of Belinda. Trustee area number 2 is west of trustee area number 1 with the southern boundary as Valley Boulevard, and it also covers a portion of the city of La Puente. Trustee area number 3, again represented by the red color, is the eastern portion of the city of La Puente, covers a portion of the city of Industry, and then has a small portion that jumps over the 60 and has the Stimson Learning Academy as well as Cedar Lane, kind of in that south of the portion boundary. Trustee area number 4 is the eastern portion south of the 60 that covers, kind of bifurcates the Hacienda Heights area. And then trustee area number 5 is the western portion of Hacienda Heights, and the northern boundary is Valley Boulevard. As I mentioned in reference, we have the CVAP data to rely on. And under scenario 1, I just wanted to point out for everyone's consideration that in trustees areas 1, 2, 3, and 5, we are able to create an influence for the Hispanic Latino population that is greater than 50%. In trustee area 4, we're able to create a influence for the Asian population that is greater than 50%. So for scenario 2, just kind of point out, as we move through the maps, you'll see that as they change, we have to recapture populations for that variance requirement. So we'll see the subtle changes if we move 1 east, then you'll kind of see how the map kind of shifts. Again, trustee area number 1 for the first 3 scenarios is going to look very city with the city of Belinda. For this case, trustee area number 2 now moves much further east and wraps around trustee area number 1's southern boundary. Trustee area number 3, since it lost that boundary, or those residents that are now covered by trustee area 2 on the northern side has to extend southeast into Hacienda Heights to balance the population requirements. Trustee area number 4 now goes on the eastern end of the district's boundaries all the way up to the 60 where it stopped short before. And then trustee area number 5 doesn't cover nearly as much as Hacienda Heights, but does go much further north into the city of La Puente. Under this scenario, we are able to create a majority for the Hispanic Latino population in trustee area number 1 and trustee area number 2. We have a plurality in trustee area number 3, and we have another majority in the Asian population in trustee area number 4.
You didn't mention 5.
There is no, sorry, I apologize. Trustee area number 5, thank you very much. It has a majority for the Hispanic Latino population as well. Thank you for catching that. On to scenario number 3. Oh, let me go back one. Alrighty. So again, trustee area number 1 looks very similar. Trustee area number 2 now much closer to what we saw in scenario number 1, but we have along the Temple Boulevard, it covers more of the neighbors to the east. Trustee number area 3 in this scenario now goes further west to the district boundary and covers a large portion of the city of Industry. Trustee area number 4 again looks similar to scenario number 1, and we see the bifurcation again of the Hacienda Heights area on the east and the west with trustee areas 4 and trustees areas 5. 5 returning now much closer to the 60 on its northern boundary. Scenario 3, highlighting again where we see those majority influences with trustee areas 1, 2, and 3 with the Hispanic Latino population, and then trustee area number 4 with the Asian population. Trustee area number 5 is about 40%, so we're close. We have the plurality, but not the majority. For scenario number 4 is where we kind of get the largest change between the 3 previous. And again, where this is submitted by the attorney's demographer. We now see that trustee area number 1 covers more west on the district's northern boundary. It's not the entire city of Belinda, as we see that a portion of that is covered by trustee area number 3 now. Trustee area number 2 moves closer to the 60, actually on the eastern side of its boundary, all the way to the 60, as we have not seen previously. Trustee area number 3 is a portion, as I mentioned, of the city of Belinda, goes all the way down to the 60 with a little small portion of it covering where the Stimson Learning Center is. Trustee area number 4, again, is on the southeast portion of the districts, covering a large portion of Hacienda Heights. And then trustee area number 5 is a portion of the district that covers Hacienda Heights to the west, with a small portion on its farther and western boundary crossing over north of the 60. Again, in this scenario, trustees areas 1, 2, and 3 create a majority for the Hispanic Latino influence. Trustee area 4 has the same for the Asian influence community, and trustee area number 5, it's very close again. We create a plurality there for the Hispanic Latino population. At this time, I'll open it up to any questions from the board, and I appreciate your time tonight.
So, in regards to how we're going to do this with the board, is if you want to ask questions about this, you can now. But if you have any suggestions or changes or anything towards the maps or any questions, you can ask questions about maps now. But providing inputs on the maps, we're going to do that after the hearing. So that way we can hear from the community first, and then the board members can go map by map and say, I think we should move it to Valley, or we should move this area to, whatever. So we'll do that after we've heard from the community. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yep. But if there's any specific questions about the process or any of that, we can go ahead and ask that now. Just kind of get to the maps.
And one thing I will just add that I have my colleague here, Ben Clark, who will be taking vigorous notes. So if it doesn't work, I'm writing it down. I'm not ignoring you. I promise. Ben and I will be. Any suggestion is not too small. We'll be taking it back to the shop and workshopping any input we get.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Good evening, members of the board. Larry Birch, Cooperative Strategies. here for maybe the final time on this process. It's scheduled to be the final time. So a lot of this information you've heard or seen before, so I'll be brief through those portions. First is the calendar that we've all come to know and love of all the public hearings we've had, pre-map, post-map. This is our third and essentially final public hearing on the maps and sequencing of the elections. And then the board will have an opportunity later in this meeting to select a map and then select the sequencing for that map and approve the final resolutions that go toward the County Committee on School District Organization, requesting the change in election method from at-large to by area. The next steps after that will be the county committee holding a public hearing here in this room sometime in April or May to receive additional feedback and then take action on that. Again, sometime probably in May is when the county committee would hold or complete its process, maybe June, just depends on their workload. We should be on the agenda for the State Board of Education meeting in May. That was all finalized and submitted to CDE immediately after the February 13th meeting, so we should be well on track for that as well. All this to get it done for the November 2020 election. We've talked about the community input meetings that the district held. In addition to what were the required public hearings at board meetings, the district held a series of 5 community input meetings the week of February 18th. You can see just where they were, what time, who attended, or how many attendees they were. We didn't know who attended. But these were some pictures from those community input meetings. So in addition to the board meetings where people have given you feedback, you've received that information. You received summaries of the information that that were provided in terms of both written and verbal comments at the community input meetings. The other thing we wanted to share tonight, as was been advertised, there's been a survey on the district's website of asking people who responded what their preferences were and to rank the scenarios in order. The map on the right-hand side is not the storm that is above us, but rather a heat map of where the responses came from based on where people selected on the map that they resided. It wasn't anything more than that, just to indicate where we've seen more thunderstorms than other places, I suppose. The chart on the left-hand side just shows the rank order and how each of those maps was ranked by the people who responded. Again, this is just one of the inputs that the district has provided for folks to provide their input. Obviously, we have meetings like this tonight for folks to provide their input directly, and we've had the community input meeting, so this is just one of those points of information and one point of preference that people have been able to express. But you can see we highlighted there the maps that received the most support, which one was ranked number 1, which one received the most votes as number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, as you can see there.
So can you explain it to us?
Sure. So you can see that what we asked is, or what the survey asked was for folks to drag the maps in order of preference and then submit that as their vote, if you will, on their order of preference. And so map number 3 received the most votes as number 1 with 978 votes to be people's most preferred map. Map number 2 received the most votes as number 2 with 230 votes as number 2. Map number 1 received the most votes as number 3 of 174. Map 5 received the most votes for 4th most preferred, map 6 for 5th most preferred, and map 4 for 6th most preferred, based on how folks responded to this survey. These are the drawing requirements in terms of what we have to look at and the considerations that the areas have to be have to contain equal number of inhabitants, up to 10% variance between largest and smallest. That's one of the first and primary consideration. The areas have to be drawn to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act, compact, contiguous, respecting communities of interest, following man-made and natural geographic features. Incumbency is an allowable consideration, just not a primary consideration, and then other local considerations. We've talked about the demographics, so I'm going to go pretty quickly through this because we've heard this before, but 116,506 folks, and that's how we divide equally, and this is based on the 2010 census. So keep in mind, we're scheduled to start counting folks again in a couple weeks. When that data is released in about a year, these areas, whichever map is selected, have to be looked at and potentially changed to make sure we're in that 10% variance, under 10% variance. So the map that is picked may be the map that is used for just one election, and depending on any population shifts that have occurred over the 10 years since the 2010 census, there could be some substantial or minor changes to the map as required. So just keep that in mind. This is information on citizen voting age population. Again, this is showing areas of increased Latino citizen voting age population, mainly in the northern part of the district. This map then shows the increased citizen voting age population for the Asian population, mostly in the southern and eastern part of the district. We have all the maps again. You'll notice there's no sequencing on the maps. After the last board meeting, we did take off the sequencing, and we'll have a separate slide on sequencing and all the 10 options you can apply to the different sequencings. So Area 1 in yellow being all of Belinda, parts of La Puente. Area 2 in green being La Puente, reaching towards downtown La Puente. Area 3, that downtown area of La Puente, reaching across Industry into parts of Hacienda Heights. Area 4 in the southeast portion of the district. Area 5 in purple on the western side, including parts of Industry and Hacienda Heights, and maybe even a smidge of La Puente there. We put the variance here at 9.42%. So that's the difference between the largest area and the smallest area, so it's compliant with the various case law register being the one that's often cited as case law for the 10% variance. In addition, we have this for those of you with good eyes. You can see this is looking at the demographics of each of the trustee areas. And we have 4 areas where a majority of the citizen voting age population is Latino, and that's areas 1, 2, 3, and 5. And then one area, Area 4, where a majority of the citizen voting age population is identified as Asian. We've also shared all the school sites that are within each of the voting areas, and this is where the physical school is located. The number after each school is the enrollment at that physical school site. It's not the number of kids within each voting area, it's the number of kids that attend the school that's located in the voting area. Just because a school is in a particular voting area doesn't mean that's where the majority of the population that goes to that school resides. It's just a measure of where the school sites are located. And this process doesn't change how the district is run. You're still a school board of 5 people who represent the district and make decisions on the whole district. So that's just information provided in terms of school sites. So map 2, again, similar, all of Belinda, all of and parts of La Puente underneath it. Area 2, instead of being western in La Puente, kind of goes diagonal across the northern part of the district. Area 3 in the southern part of La Puente, reaching down into Hacienda. Area 4, pretty similar to Scenario 1, and then Area 5 shifts to the north, taking in less of Hacienda and more north into La Puente. 7.03% variance, so that's compliant with the requirements of case law. In terms of population, we have 3 majority Latino areas, 1 majority Asian area, and 1 plurality Latino area. So areas 1, 2, and 5 are majority Latino. Area 4 is a majority Asian, and Area 3 at 47.42% is a plurality area, meaning the Latino population is the largest group but not a majority. And these are the school sites identified in each of those. And we have at the bottom the number of school sites and students on those, so you can see the difference among the different areas. Scenario 3, similar to Scenario 1, just some movement to shift things a little bit. But again, Area 1, Belinda, all of Belinda, parts of La Puente. Area 2 in the northwest. Area 3 takes in more of Industry and populated areas there, coming across to La Puente, across to Hacienda. Area 4 in the south east, and Area 5 on the western side, crossing the 60 there. And similar demographics to Scenario 2 in terms of 3 majority Latino areas, 1 majority Asian area, and 1 plurality Latino area. And You can see the distribution of school sites again. This is all, again, information that's been out there for quite some time with the original 4 scenarios. This is the last of the original 4. This is the one that was submitted by Mr. Perez and members of the community who submitted the demand letter to the school district. Just under 6% population variance, so it's within the 10% allowed. You can see Area 1 is portions of Belinda stretching west into La Puente. Area 2 being La Puente down towards the 60. Area 3, the southern part of Belinda and La Puente down, just crossing the 60, right by the Dibble Center. Area 4 in the southeast, Area 5 in the southwest. Similar demographics to scenarios 2 and 3 in terms of number of majority areas for members of protected classes, and you can see the school sites there as well. So after those 4 scenarios were originally released, at the first post-map public hearing, there was some feedback from the board to look at some other options. And so scenario 5 is a version of scenario 1. And the only difference is that it shifts the La Puente High School campus from Area 2 to Area 3. That's the only difference. In this one, you can see it's about 9.31% population variance, so just about the same as scenario 1. There's just a few folks who are residing around the high school that get moved a little bit over. But otherwise, this map is the same as scenario 1. Same demographics as scenario 1. And then obviously with the distribution of schools, it's just the movement of La Puente High School from the green area to the red area, or salmon, depending on your perspective. Scenario 6 is another option off of scenario 1. So in addition to moving La Puente High School, I'm going to avoid coughing because that will get me some dirty looks probably. Scenario 6 is a version of scenario 1, moves La Puente High School into Area 3, and also puts Los Altos and Newton together in Area, in Area 4. So that's the other change that happened from scenario 1 to make scenario 6. You can see the population variance at 4.8% is within the legal limits of the register case. Demographics the same as scenarios 1 and 5 in terms of 4 Latino majority areas and 1 Asian majority area on citizen voting age population. And then we just moved a couple of schools around on this chart. And then at the last meeting, you'll recall there was a map that was provided by a member of the community, Ms. Hunt. And so we've created that as scenario 7, following the drawing that she had. What you'll see here is that the variance is at 26.19%. Not enough people south of the 60 for it to be 2 trustee areas on its own. And so there's 2 people north of the 60 for it to be just 3 trustee areas. So it's out of variance with what's allowed under the case law. So it's not a map that we would recommend that you would be able to approve because of that population variance issue. But we did want to share what that looked like with you and the community. Similar demographics to some of the other maps in terms of this, but again, these are all numbers that would have to move in order for it to be a viable scenario in terms of adopting under the law. And then you can see the breakout of schools there. To help the discussion, we created this chart looking at the criteria that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation and trying to measure each of those scenarios against the criteria and use the helpful green, red, and just orange for those that met, didn't meet, or kind of met. So you can see in terms of population, all of them are within compliance except for scenario 7. You can see that all of them are drawn to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act, but you see 1, 5, and 6 to create the additional majority area there. And I just realized now that should be 1 majority Asian area. See, that's a typo that I repeated over and over again. So if you correct that to say 1 majority Asian area in all of the maps, I apologize there, and it should say 4 majority Latino areas in scenario 1 and 3 in 2, 3, and 4, and 4 in 5, 4 and 6, and 3 and 7. I will not do math again. The others, in terms of compact and contiguous, they all met that requirement. In terms of communities of interest, we did say no on scenario 4 just because it divided Belinda, and that's something we remember hearing at the first meeting, is the idea to keep all of Belinda together at the first pre-map hearing, so that was something there. They all followed man-made or natural geographic features, respecting incumbency. Scenarios 4 and 7 had 3 board members in one area. All the other scenarios had 2 pairings of board members, so while you could argue 4 and 7 had no indications of incumbency in them, you could argue that the other scenarios had some, looking at incumbency, so that's why we put partially there. So aside from my inability to count on criteria 2, hopefully that just helps through the discussion process. And then sequencing options. I had to get out a piece of paper to make this one to make sure I got all the potential pairings right. Took me a lot longer than you would think it should. But there are 10 different ways that these could be sequenced. I'm not, looking at where board members reside. That wasn't part of this. This was just all the potential options, so that you had all of the different ways that the board could select the areas to be elected in which order. So you see in option A, it would be areas 1 and 2 would be in 2020, and 3, 4, and 5 would be in 2022. And I just did green and red just to help pair those together. So scenario B, it would be areas 1 and 3. C would be 1 and 4. D would be 1 and 5. This is just to help you see all the different options that there are. Some of these probably aren't ones you would consider, but they are just there so you can see the full spectrum of options. With that, I think I just want to do the public hearing and then can answer questions from the board afterwards.
Yes. All right.